So good morning, everyone. My name is Meenal Srivastav, and I am the facilitator of this session this morning. The title of the session is We Don't All Benefit, Social Inequalities and the Political Economy. And this morning, the first presenter we have is Professor Sara Dorow. She is the founder, director of Community Service Learning, an ex-director, I must say. And she has been doing her a Ph.D. from Minnesota University. She has been in Edmonton for the past 10 years and has been working on Fort McMurray related research for the past 5 years. Currently, she is heading a team of Alberta scholars or researchers on a national project looking at employment-related mobility. Without further ado, you do have a little introduction of the talk that Professor Dorow is going to give this morning, and I would like to invite her and remind everyone that she has 20 minutes to make her presentation. Sarah.
Changing batteries. we'll be with you.
Okay, so that's forward.
Can we put it up?
Oh yeah, maybe so would help.
And sorry, forward is on the right?
Yes.
Okay, while they're getting my PowerPoint up, I'll just get started. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Parkland Institute Conference once again. And thank you so much for being here, so many of you, on a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. That's fantastic. And it's really also a pleasure to be here with Teresa Turner today. I have a cold, and so forgive me if my voice is kind of off. And if I have to stop to blow my nose, I know you'll forgive me as well. A resident of Fort McMurray gave me this photo several years ago. It's a snapshot of one of his favorite T-shirts about Fort McMurray, and if you can't read it, it says Fort McMurray, the world's largest cul-de-sac. This tends to bring chuckles to people who live there because it kind of expresses for them this sense of living at the end of the highway and the constant movement of people and material goods in and out of that place on such a rapid and regular basis. And so it certainly rings true for some people. On the other hand, of course, like most cultural images, it also silences and doesn't say certain things. So, of course, it erases in one stroke the many histories and peoples of the region who have traversed this land for many, many years, Cree, Dene, Chippewan, and Métis, that have no resemblance to a cul-de-sac at all, right, for them. My research on people's experiences of living and working in Fort McMurray and the possibilities and challenges of imagining, let alone practicing, community in the region, I did this from 2007 to 2010 or so, has demonstrated that, to me, that perhaps our standard conception of social impacts is its own kind of cul-de-sac. We're very good at naming and measuring social impacts, but we're also very good at repeating them over and over again, over boom-bust cycles and also across resource economies. We're also not very good at taking into account the full and varied extent of the social inequalities that are built into the very development of the oil tar sands. I use oil/tar sands to kind of keep alive the tension in the discourse about what Gord yesterday just referred to as the sands. So I'll do that today as well. I'm not going to review the usual laundry list of social impacts in the sands today. These are fairly well known. There was a 2007 article in The Economist that was entitled "Boomtown on a Bender" that referred to, quote, overstretched infrastructure and soaring drug use, which was kind of a shorthand for the many social and physical material kinds of problems that were besieging Fort McMurray, from transportation issues with Highway 63, overburdened health and service providers, to drug gangs and sexually transmitted diseases. The problem, however, is that social impacts have been conceived as unfortunate but inevitable side effects of oil development that can be measured and mitigated. There are at least a couple of problems with this. This work tends to look at impacts on the community as a whole, and not on differential impacts on diverse populations. It also holds constant certain economic assumptions that development must proceed apace, that conditions must be right for investment, that laborers must be freed, in quotes, to fill the shortages of just-in-time production in the sands. I think an important shift is necessary toward looking at the everyday social and cultural implications of how the sands industry is itself organized. So I think this means asking about the assumptions and alleged inevitabilities of the political economy. And so we need to ask, as I have up here, what social and cultural inequalities are built into, reproduced by, and or created anew by the so-called economic imperatives of the oil tar sands mega program. So what are the sometimes mundane ways by which the given realities or necessities of sands development contribute to particular social arrangements, especially as those are raced, classed, and gendered? And that's kind of where I'll be focusing today. Others at the conference have addressed Aboriginal issues in the area, and I won't be directly talking about that, but I'm certainly happy to think about that with you during the Q&A. So what I'll present to you then is just a few examples from my field work, which was conducted during the height of that first decade boom, and then into the downturn from 2007 to 2009. Really was when I did most of my field work. And I've got up there kind of the methods that I used, which I won't repeat for you. I probably don't need to do this for this crowd, but I thought a refresher about Fort McMurray might be useful. It is the urban service area to the very large regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, which covers the kind of northeast quadrant of Alberta, which was incorporated in the late 1990s quite deliberately to encompass the tax benefits of oil sands development. So Fort McMurray is really a resource city now. And what I'm calling a corporate community in some of my work. And so it has grown tremendously. The projections are, although they keep changing, that it will grow tremendously again in the 20s, but 2020s, but it's really hard to know. I think it's really important that 25+% of the population is estimated to be a mobile population. Mobile, I put in quotes quite often because I've talked to mobile workers who've been there for 10 years, on and off. And of course, it's really important that it's an increasingly diverse place and that there are very high wages, but also incredibly high disparity and incredibly high housing costs. Some of you will know that now the average house in Fort McMurray is over $600,000, and the average income is, I think, up to $160,000+. So with those reminders, I'm going to take a few of the alleged necessities and assumptions of oil or tar sands development and try to demonstrate the built-in inequalities that I've come across. So these are just kind of examples that I hope illustrate the ways in which certain kinds of inequalities are either created or compounded by how development itself is organized in the sands. So the first thing I want to think about is the mobile, flexible workforce. Our oil economy is contributing to the problematic naturalization of a globally mobile workforce that is supposed to be able to get up and move to wherever there is work, when there is work. And so, of course, there are tens of thousands of mobile workers that come to Alberta, and they have come across from across the country and across the world. The usual rationale for this is that there's an inevitable need. When you have resource development, it's simply inevitable that you will need to have right away a high workforce that will have to come from elsewhere in high numbers. And that many trades workers are simply exercising their choice to go to where there is work and decent paying work. It's also common, as was the case during my research in Fort McMurray, that mobile workers are kind of blamed. They're the scapegoat for all the stresses on the social and physical infrastructure of not being invested, right, in the local community. The problem with these assumptions is that they do not question how the organization of these industrial projects actually kind of manufacture the particular volume and type of need for mobile workers. Indeed, that many mobile workers think of Fort McMurray as just a place to work, to make money while you can and get out, as this man drew on his map during an interview for us of Fort McMurray. Work, make money, and then he hadn't checked off leave yet. And that idea of get her and get out is right in line with the broader rhetoric of the sands as a work destination for Canadians. Another part of the story is that workers are coming to Fort McMurray because there's work there relative to places where they've come from. The waves from the Atlantic provinces, then from Ontario and Quebec and BC, of course, match what's, the fact that there aren't as decent paying jobs back home. And yet another part of the story is the organization of construction itself as a phase in sands development, but one whose timelines are incredibly variable and uncertain, and it's a moving target as to those construction phases and when they happen. It's also very seasonal work, and most often done through contractors for very specific phases of project development. So all of this spells a kind of context of variability, uncertainty, just-in-time production, and really contributes to this sense of mobility is what we need and want here. But how mobility affects people's lives varies by other social categories of identity and situation. So I want to talk a bit about temporary foreign workers as well. By 2009, there were at least 60,000 temporary foreign workers in Alberta, many of them working in and around Fort McMurray. We know, of course, that their choices are limited by the fact that they are tied to an employer in many ways, and so their status in Canada is quite precarious. But we also tend to forget that the many temporary foreign workers that work in retail and service sector, including in Fort McMurray. So I was interested in what it was life like for them at the epicenter of oil development when they were working not in oil, but in the retail and service sector. And of course, their pay is quite a bit lower than those who work in the oil and tar sands. So many of them are living in very close quarters, many people to an apartment. And in Fort McMurray, the rapid pace of development, high turnover, and availability of jobs exacerbates the employer's sense that they have to hire temporary foreign workers because they can't keep workers. And so this kind of ready workforce that has to stay is especially enticing for employers in the retail sector there. But what is even of more interest to me is how the boom-bust cycles affect hiring practices in the retail service sector. So it's not just oil sands sector, but how are other sectors also affected by boom and bust cycles? So it creates a kind of hierarchy of reserve pools of labor. So, for example, this employer who is here talking about comparing 2008, the pre kind of downturn and after the downturn. Immigrants and temporary foreign workers both fill in the gaps. Many immigrant applicants were hired on the spot during the boom period. Literally, you walk in the door, there's a 5-minute interview, you're hired, you're in, because they're so desperate for workers. But as this retail employer describes, to provide a retail and consumer life for others, you hire immigrant temporary foreign workers. So oil sands workers benefit from the fact that immigrants and temporary foreign workers are being hired in the retail service sector. But they're a kind of necessary, seen as a kind of second choice hire to locals who speak English, but were unavailable during boom times. What's interesting then is during boom times, many of them who were oil sands workers were laid off and then hired in the retail service sector as a stopgap measure before they could go back and work in the sands industry again. And so there's this variability of hiring that to me is a kind of classed and raced hierarchy of reserve pools of labor who will fill in the retail service sector. A second issue that I want to look at briefly is the culture of safety and of shift work, which are related to each other. Time is different in the oil sands or the tar sands region, which is you have overtime, shift time, and just sped up time. And I got very interested in how this affected a multicultural workforce. So the culture of safety, which is really important there, really emphasized, right? Safety training is constant, safety reminders are constant. But of course, I'm interested in the duplicities of that, as Bob Barnettson also addressed yesterday. I would add that sometimes this is a culture of taking individual responsibility more than one of safeguarding rights. And it can also butt up against the pressures of time in this context. Many interviewees talked about a kind of competition to get more hours working while the getting's good in the sands industry. So in my interviews with temporary foreign workers and secondary migrants, it became apparent that this context had some really particular effects for them. So, for example, temporary foreign workers are especially apt to keep their head down and not report safety issues. As this Filipino worker talked about, she was a hotel worker, she was one of the very rare people who actually reported the fact that she was using very harsh chemicals and didn't want to be exposed to them every day or to expose the guests in the hotel to them every day. Many of the people working in janitorial and driving jobs in the last boom were not necessarily temporary foreign workers, but secondary migrants who had initially come to Canada and then moved to Fort McMurray to work and to try to find a better job. We interviewed a group of young Muslim women, and they had all been fired en masse one day for wearing skirts to their janitorial jobs. They had been told they could wear their skirts out to sight and then change into pants once they got there. But they wore their skirts out to sight on the bus and then were fired for wearing skirts when they got there. So they saw this also exacerbated by the boom bust cycle because they I can't prove this, but they said they felt like this was because this was right at the downturn and now there were other workers available to be hired. So it felt convenient to them. Along similar lines, we talked to a number of Muslim drivers and other workers where their employers were saying, we simply can't work around your prayer schedule. Sorry, up here time is everything. Everything's measured by very clear timelines. We can't make time for your cultural practices. I think for me, what's interesting about this is partly how time then exacerbates the problem of actually doing some multicultural training. And so we talked to a number of employers about this, and they would usually say, we just don't have the time to actually do the training and support for a multicultural workforce, especially during boom times. The ironic thing is that during booms is when they would hire a more diverse workforce. But then in bust times is when they actually have time to do the training, and the resource development is when they would actually be more likely to hire locals. So this is a kind of exacerbating problem of boom-bust cycles. If I've got a couple of minutes, 1 minute. Okay, she's giving me 2, that's nice. I want to go through this quickly, which is just also another thing we got interested in was kind of masculinized work and gendered arrangements that are exacerbated or compounded by sands development. It's no secret this is kind of masculinized work and in the sands region, but it's also, I think, really important that how the particular way this political economy works can affect gendered arrangements of childcare, for example. So for people who do have families in Fort McMurray, there are particular kind of consequences or contextual factors. One is that there's very little childcare. Well, there's not enough childcare like in most of Alberta, but what's interesting is that there's no 24-hour childcare, very little part-time childcare. So the childcare doesn't match the actual work schedules in the sands industries. And it's very difficult, of course, to hire childcare workers at $14 an hour in that particular economy. So families face really difficult decisions about how they're going to balance work and life. So for example, we found in our research that many women were arranging part-time work around their husband's schedules in sands industries. So they were actually becoming the flexible workers who would work part-time and do the childcare because they wouldn't make as much money and because there was so much overtime in their husbands' lives. They would also talk about how far out the commute was, and so that commute also affected, kind of out to work at site, affected their decisions about childcare. There were also, of course, there are many, many nannies in Fort McMurray. I don't know the numbers, but there are hundreds of Filipino nannies in Fort McMurray. And so as this childcare worker discusses, she's been in Fort McMurray a very long time looking at childcare, the choice for oil sands workers is to hire a Filipino nanny. Given all of the overtime, if you have somebody live in, they can also help get dinner ready and cook and really fill in for the time that you're making money out at oil sands. They can be doing the social reproductive work at home. So again, you have a kind of hierarchy of labor that really supplements the energy extraction in the sands industry through hiring nannies. I'm going to have to skip this next one, and I'll just leave that up as my final kind of gambit of the kinds of questions that I think represent a re-presentation of how we think about social impacts and how we understand them in the sands industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sara, for a very insightful presentation and also for sticking to the time. I really appreciate that. I really hope that you'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about the gender dimension of the work that you're doing. I think that's such an important component, and because of the time, of course, Sara couldn't talk much about it, but hopefully in the question-answer round, there will be more opportunities. So our next presenter is Teresa Turner. She's from Alberta's Peace River country. She completed a Ph.D. at the London School of Economics on crude oil pricing and co-edited Oil and Class Struggle, Arise Ye Mighty People, and papers in Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, Reviews of African Political Economy, World Development, Canadian Journal of Development Studies, Feminist Economics, and elsewhere. She's part of the editorial collective of Canadian Dimension, Journal of African and Asian Studies, Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, and the new journal, Capital as Power. She currently works on African political economy, climate change, fossil fuel extraction issues, gendered social movements, and the global transition from a hydrocarbon civilization to a solar commoning civilization. How interesting. Teresa Turner teaches in the Sociology and Anthropology Department at the University of Guelph. I'd like to welcome Teresa to give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you're as enthusiastic when I finish. It's a real honor to be here. I think it's the fourth time I've been invited to speak at a Parkland conference. I want to launch a provisional, tentative draft revolutionary ecofeminist manifesto for the 21st century. And this is presented in three parts. One, I review very briefly some of the efforts to keep fossil fuels in the ground. Secondly, I look at what I call the theory of ethicized, gendered, class analysis. And lastly, I consider two cases that indicate to me how we can actually make a transition from the current for-profit, commodity, capitalist, fossil fuel global system to an alternative, commoning, collective, solar-based epoch, a whole different civilization. So we are facing ecocide, and we have to keep fossil fuels and uranium in the ground in order to avoid that ecocide. Also, we have to protect the forests. This does focus the mind on efforts, direct efforts, to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And I'm sure that many of us have heard the four-part poem, if you will, keep the gas under the grass, keep the coal in the hole, keep the tar sand in the land, and keep the oil under the soil. So let's look at some instances of efforts to do so. And they are interesting in part for their gendered nature, whereby usually women at the very bottom of this hierarchy of labor power, thank you for mentioning the hierarchy of labor power, which can be considered on a global scale, the initiatives of women joined by men in an alliance to take action to keep fossil fuels in the ground. We have the very important case of the almost 1 billion barrels of oil in the Ecuadorian Amazon in the Yasuni area, which from 1997 have been slated to stay in the ground if about half the dollar value can be raised internationally. Anyone here can make a contribution to keep that oil underground. We have the case of Costa Rica, which I worked on for years, whereby in April of 2002, the Costa Rican government, the new government, won its election because it had as its main plank a commitment to not allow any oil exploration and production in Costa Rica or in the offshore Pacific or Atlantic shores or waters. We have efforts to keep the tar sands in the land. We have the efforts of the Walpole Island First Nations women, the Akikwe water defenders, just south of Sarnia, to stop, a successful effort to stop 350,000 barrel a day Shell refinery expansion. And the women did that in a remarkable way. In one of the mandated community Shell meetings, they requested that there would be no paper, and they brought their children who had been born with birth defects. 1 in 10 of their pregnancies either end or prematurely or produce children with birth defects. And so we had this whole evening of women talking about, and sometimes their children talking about, the endocrine disruption that the oil industries have imposed on that community, whereby out of every 3 children that are born, 2 are female and 1 is male. And Shell dropped that refinery expansion like a hot potato immediately. This was in 2008. So we have a lot of efforts to keep oil in the ground. What about gas? We have the anti-fracking initiatives in New York State, in France, in Quebec, where over 700 community groups, largely led by women, were the foundation, the roots of the Quebec so-called Maple Revolution, the uprising in Quebec, which is ongoing. With regard to coal, we have many, many instances around the world of keeping coal in the hole. The climate camps in the UK were very much led by women. They were eco-feminist initiatives. Their efforts in South Africa to end coal mining. There was the railroad blockage of the huge coal project for export to China in Mozambique this January. And then, of course, there are so many initiatives to stop uranium production for nuclear and to discontinue this nuclear renaissance, so-called, especially after Fukushima. Now, I want to go to the second part of what I want to talk about, which is it's about theory. It's about a theoretical framework. It's a little bit demanding. It might be of particular interest to people who want to place some of their knowledge and their experiences in a global and historical framework that's geared towards an actual transition from a capitalist fossil fuel epoch, a whole civilization, to a solar civilization based on commoning. prioritizing life, not profit. It has 5 elements or 5 dimensions. The first one is the hierarchy of labor power, where you have a class line, you have the exploiters, your 800 billionaires above the class line, and the other 7 billion of us below the class line, the 1%, the 99%, if you will. And this 7 billion of us who are in the exploited category can be divided into men and women. Under capitalism, women produce labor power, and for no wage, or for $14 an hour, which doesn't wash, right? So you have within this category of men, you have white men usually monopolizing the salary jobs and some of the wage jobs. You have black men. Under the gender line, you have white women and black women. And this hierarchy works to assist in the construction of many global for-profit value chains. And the resistance that comes up from below is focused on building alternative commoning, not-for-profit, for-life value chains. And within this hierarchy of labor power, we have 2 very interesting groups. One is what I call the male deal, which is a cross-class and often cross-race deal, usually between men, 99% between men, to facilitate the building of this for-profit value chain, and using sexism and racism to pump up the profits from the very bottom and from nature to the corporate bottom line of those 800 billionaires. And you have another very important group in this hierarchy of labor power, which is women at the bottom taking action to defend life. And it's usually, if we look at the instances of efforts to stop fossil fuel and uranium extraction, it's usually Indigenous women, La Via Campesina women, unwaged women, housewives, the women of Quebec in all these villages saying no to fracking. It's women at the bottom with allies from amongst men who break with that male deal and will not participate in that male deal. So what do these 2 groups, the male deal and this ethnicized gendered class alliance, fight over? This is the second aspect of the framework. They fight, I call it a fight for fertility, which broken down more is a fight for control over the capacity to reproduce and maintain life, whether plant, human animal, or non-human animal life. Fight for control of the capacity to bring forth and sustain life and to have access to the prerequisites of life, most importantly, clean air, water, and food. I go on to the third aspect of this framing, which is the initiatives that you see with respect to the fight for fertility in 4 different sites. The site of production, where we see strikes, wage workers striking against the capitalist. The site of consumption, we just saw in California, a lot of people voting, 47% of the population voting to have GMO labels on their food. They lost that initiative. There was a big struggle which is ongoing. We have struggles, this fight for fertility, at the point of social reproduction. We're trying to defend national health care in Canada. We're trying to defend free, high-quality public education from corporate capture. And finally, we have this fight for fertility, in particular at the site of nature. And here we think of the Niger Delta, where I've worked for from 72 to the present in Nigeria, where we have women being very much at the forefront of that struggle, increasingly so. I go on to the fourth aspect, where you see at these 4 sites of struggle, production, consumption, social reproduction, and nature, you see a circulation of struggle. And it's very similar to solidarity strikes. That is when people confront capital at one point in the corporate for-profit value chain, it weakens that chain, that global chain, and it opens the door for people to act in another place. And we do see this kind of boomerang effect, both horizontally and vertically along these corporate value chains and these integrated corporate operations. This is exacerbated, this is encouraged, this is assisted by what Marx in chapter 32, volume 1 of Capital called the imperative of large corporations to get bigger and bigger and more global, and in the process destroy and cause hardship and environmental degradation, but also to create a more and more globalized working class that Marx claimed was, by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself, increasingly organized, united, and disciplined, and transformed into not just a class in itself, but a class for itself. And I think that were he alive today, he was talking about this back in the 1860s, so 150 years later, we have a consciousness amongst people who see themselves as part of the 99%, who are focused on, especially the big banks, that are part of the petrodollar, weapon dollar coalition. That is, the oil companies, the weapons companies, the military contractors, and the big banks. So, and I'm thinking very much here of this new social form that is the 99%, that is all the people who understand ourselves to be part of the exploited, and only about 20% of us in the world are waged, and 80% of us are unwaged. The great majority of us are not paid salaries or wages. That this is a new social form that is capable of making this transition to a new kind of world. And the last element is the oil slave, that is the capacity to work embodied in a barrel of crude oil. And this is a different use of the notion of oil slave from the use made by Andrew Nikiforuk in his brilliant book, which I hope we all can get access to, and in his brilliant talk yesterday. For me, I have a labor theory of energy, a labor theory of fossil fuel. A barrel of oil can do a lot of work. It can do 14 person-years of work. So the capitalist that has that barrel of oil has the capacity to do manual work for 14 years using that oil. And that's oil extracted from the ground. That's not part of a different kind of carbon, a different kind of emissions that's part of a natural cycle. You grow the wood, you burn the wood, it goes into the air, it's reabsorbed in photosynthesis. That's a different kind. This is fossil fuel that 1 million years ago was living, right, or 2 million years ago. So the extraction of oil from the ground and the capturing of these oil slaves that we have in fossil fuel, in barrels of oil, is what is causing the ecocide, and what the initiatives to keep the fossil fuels in the ground that are women-led are focusing on to stop, to free the oil slaves. Now, what do these oil slaves do for capitalists? They do two things. One, oil is a commodity like any other commodity. The capitalists get it, they sell it, they make a profit. But much more importantly, the capitalists, and this is why fossil fuels are so central to the capitalist epoch, the capitalists use the fossil fuel, the energy, to compete with other capitalists and to smash up the working class. First of all, to compete with other capitalists, if they invest in technology, they need to fuel that technology. They can produce their widgets or whatever more cheaply, and they can get more market share and wipe out the less technologically advanced producers. So capitalists compete with each other using fossil fuel. But they also address militant workers by increasing technology, getting rid of the workers, putting in automation. And in so doing, the capitalists become increasingly vulnerable to a cutoff in their fossil fuel supply. And that means they become increasingly vulnerable to these actions by gendered, ethnicized class alliances to keep fossil fuels in the ground. I come to the last part of my talk, which is a review of the last decade, and I'm only going to give 2 instances of the development of what I would call a prefiguration or a kind of indication on the horizon of an actual transition from this fossil fuel for-profit capitalist epoch to a commoner's solar epoch. Many of you will know that in 2002, in a place called Escravos, Nigeria, Escravos is Portuguese for slave, where for 400 years, human energy in the form of captive Africans was exported to produce the commodities that were part of the triangular trade that the Industrial Revolution was built on. So Escravos today is the site of Africa's largest export of energy slaves, of barrels of oil. And Chevron, Texaco Chevron, owns a very massive oil export terminal in Escravos, Nigeria. So in 2002, 800 women took over and shut down that terminal, occupied that terminal for 11 days, and they shut down the oil industry right throughout the onshore production area in Nigeria. Well over 1.5 million barrels of oil was shut in, and there were a lot of kind of copycat shutdowns of flow stations and whatnot throughout the region. And in doing this, they used the curse of nakedness. And some of you will notice that I labeled my talk The Curse of Nakedness Against the Curse of Oil. And what the women of Nigeria do, and especially in this region, is that they expose their private parts, as they put it, to any company or man that they see taking action that threatens life itself. And what they're saying there is, we render you impotent. You cannot make a profit. You're going to go bankrupt. We want you out of here. You cannot. We're socially ostracizing all people involved with this, all contractors involved with this company. And they did that. And there was a huge ripple around the world where in hundreds and hundreds of instances, people went naked, and especially women, but men joined them, to spell out no war for oil, because Bush was just about to invade Iraq at that time. And what the women did was they stopped Chevron's access to Chevron's commodity, oil, right? They kept the slaves, the oil slaves, in the ground. At the same time, Oil Watch International had a consumer boycott against Texaco Chevron, and there was a different boycott, but at the same time, against ExxonMobil in the UK, where a quarter of the credit cards, the ESSO credit cards, were destroyed by their owners. A very successful boycott. So what do we see here is a kind of premonition or foreshadowing or prefiguration of the kind of transition from the dominance of large corporations in the world political economy to a kind of radical communal democracy. We see that Chevron simultaneously was denied part of its production and part of its consumption. And when a corporation doesn't have inputs and outputs, that corporation disappears. It just goes poof. That's the end of it. Right? So let's fast forward to this year. And I refer here to the Occupy Arab Spring movement. In Yemen, women got together and said, we're trying to fight for resource control, for democratic control over our oil and oil infrastructure. And we're getting close to controlling it. And is there anybody out there who has what we need, which is food? Has anybody else got charge of food production and is willing to exchange with us directly and get rid of the Cargills and the Monsantos and the public, the state and the private oil majors, so that we can dispose of them and have a commoning, mutually beneficial relationship? So in conclusion, in this draft revolutionary ecofeminist manifesto for the 21st century, the idea is that we need to support, to recognize, to support, and to enhance cross-border simultaneous direct action to break up the capitalist value chain, and at the same time, because nothing's destroyed until it's replaced, to build the commoner's value chain, and thereby make a transition from a fossil fuel, for-profit capitalist civilization to a solar commoner's civilization. Thank you.
Yes, please. Yeah. Thanks, Teresa, for a wonderful, very thought-provoking presentation. And of course, in the light of the fact that the most recent energy report tells us that the United States is sitting on a very large shale oil deposit. They are geared to become the largest exporter of oil in the next less than 5 years' time. And also that they have already started sanctioning the tar sands production in the United States, Utah being the first such province or state in the United States that has allowed this expansion of tar sands development. So the oil economy is obviously not just alive, but is likely to expand, and we are likely to see a lot of the need for these types of analysis more and more in future. But I would like to open the floor now for a question-answer round. So please identify yourself and ask a question, but please keep your question as brief as possible and let me know who is that directed to. So we have one hand up there so far. Okay.
Thank you both so much. I'm from the Peace River country, so I relate with you, Teresa, and the North in general. My name's Lori Sigurdson. I'm a social worker here in Alberta, and certainly many of my colleagues in Fort McMurray tell me very challenging stories of working in that area. But I'd like to focus about women in politics. And in Alberta, we have about 22% of elected MLAs are women. And my understanding is that there sort of is a critical mass when a certain percentage of women are actually elected in an area, more fair, just, equal policies happen. In the Nordic countries, it's almost parity. We know, certainly we've heard through this weekend about how much better they're doing in lots of ways than we are here. Teresa, you mentioned Costa Rica, voted in a government that are not going to do further drilling. I'm just wondering if there is a gender connection there with their elected officials. Anything either of you want to say about just women taking leadership? I know women do grassroots leadership all the time, but I think really where the change will come is if more women step up into political leadership. And I just would like to hear both of your comments about that.
Okay, thank you.
Do you want to take 3 or 4 questions? 3 at a time.
Are there any other questions? We can take a few others before the presenters have a chance to answer. So there was a hand that went up first there, and then over there, and then over there. So yes.
Hi, my name is Inika. My question is directed at Teresa. You talked about
Can you take the microphone there, please?
Hi, my name is Inika. My question is directed at Teresa. You speak of a commoner solar epoch, and I was wondering if you could expand on what that would look like.
And there was a question up here, yes?
Do you have?
Oh, yeah. Hi, my name is Jim, and this is for Sara. I think it would make sense to just get rid of the temporary foreign worker program, and wonder what your comment is, because to me it seems like it's a race to extract resources out of the ground as quickly as possible. It doesn't really benefit Canadian society because it's a way to try to reduce labor costs when, that's probably the wrong answer, and then that puts more money in the hands of workers versus the corporations. It doesn't sound like the temporary foreign workers really enjoy it. I'm sure they would rather find meaningful work back where they came from, and I don't know how you solve that problem, but if it's also about bringing in immigrants to Canada, I think there's a much stronger argument if we want to help people in third world countries is to bring in more refugees especially and provide training and education to them. So just wondering what your thought is on terms of should we even have a temporary foreign worker program?
We will take 2 more questions. There's a lady in black over there, and then the gentleman in the red shirt.
I just have a comment and no question. Sara, we love you, but to Teresa Turner, you are a beacon in the dark.
Beacon in the dark.
More power to you.
A solar beacon. Yeah. She's a solar beacon.
Hello. I guess my question is to both of the presenters. My son worked in the oil patch for a number of years, and he eventually had to quit after he became married because it was impossible to maintain a relationship. He was working, he got paid for 12-hour shifts, but he was working 14 to 16s by the time they were traveling back and forth to the rig sites. So what is the excessive hours worked in the oil patch due to family life, and it dislocates you from the environment? You're just there. I mean, your life is somewhere else, and this is just you rip off the earth to make money.
Okay, I think we'll stop here for the first round of questions. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Actually, the women in politics question, or just questions that were directed at me?
It's up to you if you find a common point.
Okay, sure. I think I'll let Teresa answer the women in politics question first in a broader way, and if I have anything to add, I'll do that. The two questions that were for me, the temporary foreign worker program, the problem is that this is a global phenomenon of mobile ready work when you want it and need it, and then a docile workforce, right? There are provinces, such as Manitoba, that actually worked out with the federal government an agreement to offer permanent residence to temporary foreign workers, all of them. Alberta resisted that. Apparently there was some new rhetoric last year that said that, well, actually, no, we want to go that direction too, but they put a review in place for the temporary foreign worker program, which is not at all adequate as a review of the program and its problems, from my understanding. So I think getting rid of it, if that means we just don't invite those workers and they have to fend for themselves, that does pose the problem in the sense that we have the reality of a global problem of, for example, workers from the Philippines, where this has become the kind of normal part of the economy there, is that workers go abroad to work and send remittances for their families. It's a huge part of their GDP. So for me, it's first of all, if we're going to have such a program, that we need to have all of the right infrastructures in place to protect rights and support people. But secondly, I think it really should be a program that leads to potential permanent residency if we have one at all. So that's my thought about that. Yeah, and the problem, of course, is that that increasingly we have an instrumental kind of immigration program in Canada, which is more and more based on what kind of economic benefits are people bringing to this country, and not a broader sense of people and the many kinds of talents and energies that they bring to our country. I just said our country. I'm an American. I shouldn't, I'm confessing, but I just said our country. I'm very proud. Secondly, I have applied for citizenship here too, just so you know. The excessive hours question, it has a lot of impacts on family life, both for families that live in Fort McMurray and families elsewhere. We did a survey at the Hub Family Resource Center in Fort McMurray, which is a really important center for families. And it became very clear that a lot of the women there were quite stressed because their husbands were gone for so many hours working out at site. But secondly, because when Daddy did come home, I had a quote there I didn't get to talk about. There's what's called daddy time, and that's transition time. And this isn't just in Fort McMurray. This is in many, many kind of resource or other economies where there's lots of overtime and shift work, where he comes home and there's the adjustment and the stress to that adjustment, where suddenly he wants to relax, but so does mom want to get the heck out of the house, right? So that's a real issue for families that live there. For families elsewhere, same kind of thing, but it's more fly in, fly out. They're flying for either a week at a time or a couple months at a time and coming home. Same kind of adjustment problem. Plus, obviously, the distance. And the fact that the workers who go there and have families elsewhere, it really does compound the sense that all I am is a worker here. Some of our research showed that, I'm really dried out from this cold, sorry. The workers that, many of the mobile workers kind of talked about their life there as kind of time standing still. Like their hopes were for down the road. Life was going to kind of happen later. And right now what I'm about is simply making the money for life later. So I think that kind of deferment also really affects, family life as well. I like your point about how it's related to environment, and I think it's a really important tension. I don't really have an answer to that, but it's a really important tension around and relationship to land and environment and the natural environment. People who live in Fort McMurray are very proud of the trails and the beautiful natural environment around them. And so there's this really, and Fort McMurray itself as a city is putting in state-of-the-art recycling facilities. They're going to have green buses, all, these wild, amazing plans for Fort McMurray that to me are so interesting next to the oil tar sands, and I think in many ways serve the sands industry because it looks really good to have that kind of greening right next door and to be able to play up the wonder of the natural environment next to that degradation. So it's very interesting tensions there. Yeah, thank you. Those are my answers, and I'll turn it over to Teresa.
In Costa Rica, women were the organizers of this broad umbrella group called Adela, which is the name of a Bribri indigenous woman who had passed on, but her son was a militant. She had fought an earlier attempt in the 1970s by the Italian state oil company Eni to explore in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic. And successfully, the indigenous people fought that off. And then her son became a militant against Harkin Oil, which was owned by George Bush, George W. Bush. And he formed, he and a lot of other people, but in particular women who were the spouses of fishermen, small artisanal fishermen, inshore fishermen. These were the women who went down and met their husbands as they came in with the catch and would identify, categorize, and weigh the fish. And what they found when Harkin started to do seismic work in the shallow offshore areas, that of course the fish catch went down dramatically, and they were able to document this day by day, which is very important in convincing the populace in general that the oil exploration was not consistent with fishing. And there are a lot of small farmers in the area, a lot of female-headed households, very, very high proportion of female-headed households, I think one of the highest in the world. And a lot of these women have small businesses where they process food, they sell it in the local market, they have perhaps what they call cabinas, small 2 or 3 accommodations for tourists, eco-tourists. So there's a very rich economy, very decentralized, very democratic, very small scale. And from all those different kinds of livelihoods came people who were elected by their community groups, and the vast majority of them female, came together in this umbrella group, Adela, and it was through that group that we successfully fought off George Bush and his cohorts and established, as I say, the first country, the first government, the first country in the world to say no to oil exploration and production, which is very important as a kind of watershed because many of us remember when the slogan, oil in the ground is money in the bank, and we should celebrate having oil. And that's really changed dramatically in the last 15 years. I have literally just come from East Africa, which is being cursed by oil right now. There's been a discovery, we all know in the south of Sudan there's oil, there's been a long war there. Right now that oil is being kept in the ground by the disputes between the government in South Sudan and North Sudan and Sudan proper about how much money the Sudan proper government will get for running the oil through the pipeline, not unlike the controversy here between the Alberta and British Columbia governments. So that oil is being kept in the ground. There's oil in Kenya, there's oil in Uganda, there's a lot of gas offshore Tanzania, Mozambique. So the women, the Maasai women and other women of East Africa are meeting together with great trepidation about the prospects for rape, family disruption, water pollution, the seizing of communal lands. There have been ethnic cleansing going on in the Tana River area of Kenya, largely because of land grabbing for pipeline and transport corridor through there out to the Indian Ocean through Lamu. So the people of, the women of East Africa are getting mobilized against the oil, and there's singers and there's dancers and there's a lot of cultural expression there too. So it's very positive. And to go to Inika's question, I want to recognize Inika's really wonderful work on oil and community in both Canada and Ecuador. What would a commoning solar epoch look like? Well, let me quote Marx to begin with. He says, "I will not write cookbooks for the future." And far be it from me to write cookbooks for the future. Although I do think Andrew Nikiforik's suggestion of a 5-point program is really on time and important. Let's get something simple that people really can grasp and understand and debate and discuss and enrich. So I'm not against programmatic action in any sense. But if we look carefully, say, at the very rich experiences that are ongoing day by day, witness Europe in a state of revolution right now, having denounced the false god of the magic capitalist market, right? The invisible hand that's all gone now in Europe at the grassroots, and millions of Europeans have no more time for that kind of nonsense. If we look at the social struggles that are sweeping the world today and will only intensify given that traded food has increased, especially the 4 basic grains, the price of that has been increasing dramatically. We are going to see another series, as we did in 2008 and 2010 leading into the Occupy Arab Spring, of food non-riots. These aren't riots, these are people's efforts to get food. Right, and to hold up food, deny food to the food corporations, right? So we're going to see another wave of that, an intensified wave of that. And if we, as activists and scholars, examine what the people say they want when they move like this, like move your money, $1 billion moved in one day, largely in the United States, but in Canada too, during the Occupy movement. Right? And people starting to occupy the ports and the choke points of capitalist transport. Look at the Oakland workers occupying the Oakland port, and a small solidarity occupation on the same day. Here you have this simultaneous joint action to break up the corporate value chain in more than one place at one time in the port of Dallas. Was it Dallas? I believe so. Or maybe, I think it was the Houston port. The Houston port. And of course, Code Pink doing nakedness demonstrations right through. And that's when a coordinated effort by the police and the other forces of repression in the United States zapped all the Occupy movements at one time. They knew that there would be a copycat kind of domino effect from one Occupy to another of these kind of port occupations. It wouldn't just be restricted to ports. So there's a very sharp polarization now between the 1% and the 99%. And I think that if we look at what people are actually doing right in our communities and across the country and across the world, we can escape the NIMBY trap, which has just plagued action in the oil industry, creative action to keep fossil fuels in the ground. That is a national program. We have to take a leaf from the book of the Indigenous Environmental Network and their wonderful Road of Destruction campaign, where they show us how terrible are the many bad effects of oil and gas extraction, exploitation, and transport right from the Arctic right on down to the Gulf of Mexico. And that wonderful poster that they've developed as a learning tool, really, called the Road of Destruction. It's on their website, the Indigenous Environmental Network. I think we can take a leaf from the Cochabamba Declaration of April 2010, at the same time as British BP was polluting the Gulf of Mexico and really all the world's oceans because they're all interconnected. 35,000 people from around the world met in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and developed a very detailed program, 18 different texts on 18 different aspects of ways to stop climate change and make a transition. I think the slogan was system change, not climate change, which came actually from the Copenhagen, December 2009 climate talks. So there's lots of material and there's lots of ideas. And when I consulted my 97-year-old father, who is grown, from the north and has been through the whole oil thing and has a very sharp mind about the content of my talk today, he said, you really should be talking to the people at Nate and Sate, because they're the ones who can bring back the railroads and shut down the oil and so on. And I think that there's a lot of technical solutions. What we need is a political solution. Right? A political power shift. And what we see emerging, these direct deals at the grassroots between people who have established control over resources, food, oil, whatever, land, fought off the land grabbers, and there's a huge struggle there all over the world. I think that kind of action is instructive of what a solar epoch would look like. I wanted to mention out of Cochabamba and out broadly, if we pay the ecological debt, if we in the North recognize that if we think of the atmosphere as a basic a dump, a garbage dump, right, that 80% of the atmosphere that has been used as a garbage dump by large corporations based mainly in the global North, and that this has really destroyed the glaciers, the water supply, the water table, the climate in the tropical areas, especially Africa, but right around the tropics, right around the globe. And we in the global North owe a climate debt to the people of the global South. And if we pay that climate debt, that would be the basis of a whole new world, a whole new civilization of commoning. I think I'll stop there. I'm very interested in contributions from the floor.
Thank you. We just have 5 more minutes, so probably we can take 2 questions. And there hasn't been any question from that side, so I'll give this side of the first chance, and then.
Yeah, John Wodak. This is a comment, not a question. Something over 20 years ago, I sat on an interdepartmental committee of the provincial government with the mandate of developing a planning framework for mega projects. And we didn't predict everything that happened in Fort Mac, but quite a bit of it. As we know, that nothing happened to the committee's recommendations, and I would say that there's been less planning and discipline in the development of the oil sands than, let's say, a bull in a china shop.
And then there's one last question in front here.
I have a quick outburst of activist enthusiasm. I just came here a little bit half sleepy, and you 2 powerful women woke me up completely and gave me even hope again for the Occupy movement. You were so strong in your, going all over the map. It even woke me up to go back to when I was, not 100 years ago, but quite a few years ago when I was doing research on the gold mines in South Africa before I came to Canada at the University of Groningen. And you mentioned this whole stuff about the gold mines and the diamond mines. Then I suddenly, when you were describing all the people who are in protest, especially the women, and I have to share this, I saw a documentary on the mine workers in South Africa who are so downtrodden and have so little hope and are treated so badly, alienation, despair. And what do they do on their Sundays? They dress up in suits that are made by themselves in workshops or whatever, and they dance for a couple of hours to gain back their identity and their self-respect. So you've been very powerful. Now comes my question, because there was a specific, you mentioned Teresa, and thanks for coming back to Edmonton, because I remember you from before. You had a specific incident about the Mozambique and the railroad there, and you mentioned quickly that the coal export was stopped. And I would like to know, was that one of the examples that, again, women did it, or was it a solidarity movement with even men involved? Could you maybe give us a little details on that?
Sure, please go ahead.
In Mozambique, there is an organization that's associated with Friends of the Earth International. And this group in Mozambique, it's women and they have allies amongst men, and they actually have coal miners and coal miners' family members involved. And they have been saying no to coal development for export for some time. And so in January of this year, a group of them courageously went out early in the morning and they set up camp right there on the railroad tracks, and they basically blocked the train for several days. They just stayed there. And eventually they were moved off by the police. So yes, it was women, it was men, and it got a lot of, it was in a way a kind of political theater, which a lot of this effort to stop fossil fuels and uranium extraction is political theater. And I want to take the opportunity to mention that this Valentine's Day coming up, the 14th of February 2013, some of you will know that Eve Ensler, the woman who wrote Vagina Monologues and did that play, she has called for a 1 billion women dance. She's asked for 1 billion women to come into public places and dance, and that we should invite 1 billion men. And if you go on her website, Eve Ensler, you'll see that literally tens of thousands of people and communities have announced that, yes, they will dance in a certain place at a certain time on Valentine's Day coming up. And maybe we could all do that too. Maybe the Parkland Institute could have a dance. And what is this dance for? This is a dance against violence, against women, against all violence, all warfare, all exploitation. It's a very systemic initiative. And it comes from the war wounded in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where rape is being used as a weapon of war. And those, as many of us know, are wars for coltan that we use in our cell phones, that the corporations are using, and all kinds of other precious metals, so that there are these wars. And the women who have been raped and mutilated have gone to this center established by Eve Ensler, and they found that dance is the most important form of therapy and self-renewal. And so this is the idea that women all over the world can dance in public. And this would be the largest joint initiative in history of the 99%.
So Sarah can have the last word.
I just wanted to have a quick comment on your comment. Thank you for your comment. Which is that, I think what really strikes me in my work in Fort McMurray, and obviously it isn't just this resource economy, but that we have a pattern of social impacts that are a problem. We measure them, speak loudly, and Fort McMurray is in a position to actually be heard because of the global gaze on the tar sands, because of the size and all of that. They actually are, I think, quite effective at getting resources, but it's resources after the fact. So we can show their impacts, the Radke report, then you negotiate for some money, right, to be kind of injected into the community, which doesn't necessarily contribute to planning, right, well for the next boom. So thank you very much to all of you, from both of us, I'm sure. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I just have to make a couple of announcements. First of all, of course, no such conference can be complete without thanking our sponsors, the Alberta Federation of Labor, Athabasca University, Athabasca, Bullfrog Power, CSU 52, Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Network of Canadian History and Environment, University of Alberta's Faculty of Arts, Woodworth Irvine Socialist Fellowship Endowment, and of course, Alberta Views Magazine, View Weekly, CJSR Radio Network. These are some of the people who have contributed to make this conference happen. Please remember that fair trade coffee and tea is being served outside, and please remember to fill in your pledge forms. And with that, I would like to thank everyone, the two great presenters and the great audience, for a very lively discussion. Thank you so much.